I'm going to do my best to make this video as interesting and historically noteworthy, in addition to tying together what exactly we're facing right now in our current world and as it continues to degrade itself. I'm going to be reading from some notes that I put together, so bear with me. As we encounter God in all of us in our own unique way, it becomes increasingly complex to the point of irreducible fortitude in the scope of understanding all that might be us, even without anything we might know of it. Human beings, angels, conscious, sentient life, whatever its particular designation, is so, it would seem, has not within its own capacity in so much as this intellectual agency any and all of us possess, could thereby provide anything close enough to that which God himself can. He might, after anything at all, commiserate to our own human agency with which we can operate, if it is not all functional. We need to add to the disclaimer because it seems quite obvious to anyone who is at all awake and paying attention to the undeniable megalomania that serves to be the ever-present unhinging of everything Western culture has managed to, against all odds, built a freedom-based free market system upon the understanding that unlike the theocratic, autocratic, dictatorial regimes driven wholly by those of the Middle East, the religious, intolerant, misogynistic understanding of Islam, not only did the European Western secular nation-states, and even before the absolute monarchs were eradicated, understood that the Ottoman Empire, 500 AD to 1475 AD, was so diametrically opposed to the Western mind of freedom and Renaissance that as the Ottoman Empire continued to advance into the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain, and from the east, northwest, in Turkey, capital of the Islamic Caliphate in Istanbul, that even as the sovereign powers of the Catholic Church had no other option than to launch the Crusades in the 11th century to confront the advancement of Islamic religious systems known then as the Ottoman Empire had for almost 400 years. Through the many Crusades and the disparate attempts to stop them from overrunning the European continent, the conquest of Istanbul in the 1400s, late 1400s, established as the Ottoman capital headquarters of the Caliphate that would serve as the launching pad to override Europe and subjugate these, albeit mostly controlled by the Vatican and the sovereign popes, was nevertheless not even close to what the Islamic hordes would have done should they gain significant influence into Europe. The word Islam means submission. We can argue over the course of days about the abject control of the Vatican over Europe during this Dark Age period and all that they had done to so corrupt as they were, but even so compared with that of Islam, there is no question that had not been the hammer martel in Gaul, modern-day France, and the Romanian Count Dracula called Vlad the Impaler in the East, are the primary reasons in the 1490s had single-handedly, along with the many crusades throughout the period, were all the still considered to be the two greatest leaders that successfully pushed back both Martel in France to Africa and Vlad the Impaler south to Istanbul, and the Renaissance was considered to be the byproduct of the success of the Europeans from being overrun entirely by Islam. So it is known as both the Renaissance rebirth after 1500 years of brutal wars, and today they are faced with exactly the very same situation. Especially the Europeans were in the 14th century, the Europeans were so opposed to the influence of Islam into the grave cultural rebirth that they took action in every possible way to stop the cultural suicide of Europe as a result of Islamic Ottoman subjugation. That understood, if they did not oppose these religious ideologies of death and submission, Europe would be nothing but a dream unrealized. In today's Europe, it seems increasingly clear that they are not only not opposed to this intolerant ideology of subjugation, but they will have become the victims of what we call the Stockholm Syndrome. The capital of Sweden is Stockholm, and the syndrome is a well-understood psychological response to the victims of the so-called countervailing influence of the existential threat. The Stockholm Syndrome, oddly enough, is a literal occurring as we speak in the whole of Europe. And even more interesting, Stockholm, Sweden itself is psychologically mistaken or being literally realized in the most in its most concrete, absolute forms. In yesterday's news, the Swedish press announced that the government would no longer provide services to women being raped by migrants in the favor of treating the hordes of Islamic radicals themselves. Talk about Stockholm Syndrome. This is the literal definition of what it means to be occurring in the city for which it is named. The easiest way to illustrate what the syndrome really involves is to say the victim has been so traumatized by the victimizer that their mind is convinced to believe that they are responsible for the victimization they had undergone, so much so that they now identify with the abuser to the extent that they now became actively and consciously made to believe this is okay. So much so that they literally are turned over to the way that things they themselves have undergone now, so as to become an active participant themselves. This syndrome was popularized as an affirmative defense in the billionaire heiress Patty Hearst when she was using this psychological newly understood idea to provide the defense of her actions that had her on camera in the bank armed with the semi-Uzi, demanding the bank employees to fill the bags with cash, and then the money talks and the law is never written in stone. It should come as no surprise this very unaccepted by the psychological community. Eventually she was able to provide enough specialized psychologists that testified to how and why, even in the face of being in the bank armed with a semi-automatic Uzi, willingly participating in the arguably the most sensationalized trial up to that time in the mid-70s, was nonetheless successful, that the jury sentenced her to only a few years in prison. The jurors themselves later said that the reason they ultimately decided to give her the most lenient of sentences they had to come to agree upon had to do with the fact that the Stockholm Syndrome defense seemed to them to make the most sense in the eyes of the jury. Considering her vast fortune, they could only conclude that the syndrome must have been the reason, because Patty Hearst, being one of the wealthiest families in the country, would have had no other reason to participate in such an extraordinary, obvious criminal act other than what the affirmative defense articulated. With the verdict of Patty Hearst, the Stockholm Syndrome has become understood as a mainstream psychological condition that is no longer even considered a debate with psychologist experts today. Getting back to the point of the larger point about the Ottoman Empire over the 1500 years until the late 14th century, at once were simultaneously pushed back east and west to Africa and south to Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, capital city of the eastern arm of the Roman Empire that continued to operate quite apart from the Western Empire that fell in 416 AD. The eastern part, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to operate for another almost 1,000 years rather well and remained a Christian stronghold in Christian thought, and it was the toxic division between the Vatican Papal Catholic religious system and the Orthodox Christian Byzantine was the real enduring problem that to this very day remains a problem. This distinction between Catholics and Orthodox is made the same as Protestant to Catholic, although that the Christians, the detrimental differences remain, ultimately come into the full absolute authority as it is eventually filled the vacuum that it was left by the death of the Western Rome in 416. The only reason it did not do so right away is only that it had been operational for only about 100 years by the 416. This vacuum needed and did require another 125 years before it assumed full authority over all the Western Europe for that which its intended purpose had always been. The Bible was created in fervent haste on the orders of Emperor Constantine, who assumed complete and total authority over East and West Rome in 313 AD. This book was created for political expediency, because once Constantine won the battle at Melbourne Bridge in 310, approximately he did a full and complete survey over the entire empire to have the best understanding of the condition of the empire. When they completed the 9-month survey, he and his advisors understood that the empire was collapsing everywhere, and he even told his advisors he didn't feel he would be able to have an empire to rule for much more than 30 years, considering how devastating the conditions were. the times, of course, Rome, of course, was the reason he decided to try and take power in the first place. The Eastern Empire, Byzantine, seemed to be still operational to his surprise, but the Western Empire capital of Rome, including North Africa and the whole of Western Europe, was definitely under the throes of a collapse. We cannot be certain who exactly it was, but most likely it was not Constantine himself who, of probably one of his advisors, told him that the secular authority was in free fall and would not literally last for another 30 years. There was one other option that did and could be arranged that could, if one done quickly enough and had the capacity to fill the vacuum once fully dead. This idea is called ex-mundane authority. It literally means that if they work quickly enough and decide who the ex-mundane authority would be, that they might just be able to pull it off. In Rome, all gods were legal, and there were hundreds. There was only one exception. The criminal Jesus god, Jew, killed under the reign of Tiberius in 30 AD, had always been outlawed by Rome. For over 300 years, the many laws to prohibit this one and only one god of the literal hundreds of them, that they had wars so oppressed that Constantine asked them, "Who should we pick?" His advisors, eagerly to please him, of course, said, "Well, what do you say, Emperor?" He told them that as he traveled the empire everywhere they went, there were churches and bishops that continually stated this Jesus guy was the one. They told him that they agreed, but the problem was not only was this God prohibited by law, these bishops were all over the empire could not only agree on the one thing, that is, this is the one, he's the one. All things that they could not agree upon were the details of what exactly he was. Things like, is he God? Was he a man? Was he both? Was he born of a virgin? Did he come back to life after death? Who exactly did he become God, if he is not at all along? All these details were increasingly important because Constantine told them he can easily decree a new law prohibiting all gods and making the new God, it's Jesus, and only him. They told him, yes, you can make that easily enough, but if these debates are not addressed in some way, provide one single belief system, it would fail. Constantine decided in 313 to issue the Edict of Milan that outlawed all gods, and only this God, Jesus, is now allowed. The problem remained, however, for how exactly are they going to fix all their arguments that will persist in this God as one agreed upon single belief system? In 334 AD, some 20 plus years after the law was established, Constantine orders the bishops all over the empire to come to Nicaea in modern Turkey, Asia Minor at that time, the Byzantine Empire that was still functional. Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, now Istanbul, prior to 330 AD, as the Western Empire continued to decline and was increasingly under the threat of collapse. Once moved to Constantine, then along with his advisors, they will have these bishops bickering, sit down in Nicaea and at 334 AD and argue these debates in details, and whoever won the debate gets their book in the Holy Bible, and the loser who would lose his head. Constantine was under no illusion that this quickest way to start his ex-mundane idea to begin the start offering something adequately capable of filling the descent of the Western Rome was to create a holy book replete with cosmology and doctrine that would, after 20 years of implementation, had yet to provide anything capable of superseding this secular authority, because the new state religion has already been since 313, but failed to articulate the political expediency it was being designed for. Once the book of 66 independent holy books, including the cosmology of Jewish Torah and prophet books, the selection and debate over this New Testament material that will establish the most necessary and definitive elements about this individual called Jesus became the most challenging parts. All of that detail about how the Holy Book was created and for what its purpose was all along should be enough for anyone to understand that Although this book seems very much and highly likely to be absolutely true, it is all the same not all of the truth. First of all, it is a holy book, not a history book. Secondly, it was never intended for a religious purpose, but rather a political arrangement to save the dying Western Roman Empire. Nevertheless, we have even more reason to examine these facts. As the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun, and everything that has been done will be done again. Just like the Ottoman Empire was for 1500 years, the most ruthless and divisive, culturally divergent existential threat to the European mind, there is absolutely nothing at all different with what is occurring today by the very same ideology, Islam, that unlike the 14th century, today the Europeans are committing cultural suicide, allowing the very same oppressive ideological, non-integrating systems of absolute and complete ruthlessness, subjugation, to not just allow refugees to migrate into Europe because of the collapse of Libya and places like Syria and other parts of the Western Africa, but to the extent that, unlike the 14th century, Europe used all that they had to push this cultural nightmare from taking complete control over the whole of Europe, because they understood this would be the cultural obliteration of not only their own religious belief of Christianity, albeit Catholic and Orthodox, is neither here nor there. There is just that. The Europeans of that time understood that their own identity was intrinsically connected to their own religious beliefs. We can easily see what it is occurring in Europe today is as much of a faction or a function of the tyrannical death cult of Islam terror and ideological theocratic idealism, because unlike the 14th century, Europe over the course of 500 years has been reduced to secular and atheistic cultural norms. As a result of the Christian religious system being functionally non-existent, the Islamic terror and the absolute of many ex-mundane authorities, such as Christianity and the peoples and leaders of Europe, are unfortunately in a unique position of being spiritually devoid of Christianity in favor of atheism and secular governments. So rather than regard the Islamic terrorists as an unacceptable to that of Europe culture, they are willingly committing cultural suicide because even an incompatible ex-mundane authority is better than nothing at all. If it seems incomprehensible to watch the nations of Europe one after the other implementing the precepts of Islam, protecting the very terrorist migrant hordes who are aggressively committing the most outrageous of criminal acts against their own people, and nation after nation is not only complicit in these escalating hostilities, and the answer is increasingly not to hold the criminals responsible for such acts as atrocities, but rather it is implementing Islamic ideological precepts, because again Europe identifies their own spiritual vacuum as a natural consequence of the terrorist migrants, that somehow this Islamic religious belief is somehow the answer to their own spiritual inadequacy. The idea here is that somehow if they please placate these Islamic belief systems, the terror they promulgate will subside if only the Europeans adopt this theocratic ideology. The Europeans are victims of their own and of hating victimology. Somehow it must be their own guilt that serves to drive this continued wide Stockholm syndrome, continent-wide Stockholm syndrome. The nations of Europe, in sharp contrast to that of the Islamic hordes, overwhelmingly them is disproportionately older, with declining birth rates as low as 1.5 children per nation state, even less than 1% in places like Italy. Along with this is a major driving force behind the adaptation of this divisive cultural distinction. You factor into the equation the sovereign debt crisis of places like Greece, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, and the Italian bond market, and the French recapitalization of their banks. There is an unusual financial benefit that for all intents and purposes would seem to place even more of a strain on the strongly straggling equity markets in the euro. The reason this particular tragedy unfolding inside Europe is being increasingly accepted within the bureaucracy of the European Union is because the financial strain is significant. It also has an opportunity for the IMF and the World Bank, along with the German Central Bank, is now increasingly pushing to liquidate these nations on the auspices of necessity of the unfolding migrant crisis. The opportunity to load them up with even more interest-based debt becomes even more of an attractive option. So that was a lot of information in 20 minutes. I had a whole lot more that I wanted to get through. I apologize for reading so quickly, but I just wrote that down an hour ago and finished it. At any rate, I'm going to write out some more videos, and I'll try to keep it at this down to the 30-40 minute time interval with what I'm going to speak about, because I've been doing these videos and they're almost like 2.5-3 hours long, and people don't want to listen to that stuff, not that way. So I'm going to have to write this stuff out like I did with this one and see if it has any traction. Okay, so I hope that you all maybe could find some degree of context, historically speaking, and the main message here is our current state of the world and what exactly is coming directly for us very, very soon. It's undisputable, irreducibly confident that it's going to happen. I hope and I think the next video will be on the Anglo-English banking establishment and how it has wielded its authority and power from the modern empires of Spain, Holland, France, England, and now the United States, how they all have declined and how our leaders are pushing for war, as so did Spain from 1492 to 1603. They had an economic crisis. They ruled the oceans and the seas. They were the empire of the world, so they went to fight England thinking that they would win. If they did, they could fix everything. They lost, of course. Their whole empire overseas is gone, and now no more Spanish empire. Next, Holland rises to this empire status, and they have West Africa and other parts of the empire that they're ruling the oceans, because whoever rules the oceans and the seas is considered the empire of the world. They changed the definition once the ancient empires were no longer the huge geographical land subjugating peoples, is what we called an empire in the ancient world. But when ships began to be built and navigate the oceans, now we consider it, in Spain was the first to be the empire of the world. And then Holland rose up again, an economic collapse happens. Immediately they push for war. Why? Because always war is the easiest, best option for the empire of the world with all the muscle having an economic collapse. So because they still have the muscle and they are the empire of the world, whoever they're going to fight, the likelihood is that they're going to win, so that they can fix everything. And the pushing for war is the easiest, best option to do, because it allows for private equity to funnel into the system of, like in the case of Spain or Holland or whatever, to stop the economic meltdown in its tracks. It doesn't fix it, just stops it while the war goes forward, and it's funded and it's active. And if they win, they come back and they can fix everything. If they lose, then they're going to be able to protect the throne of Spain or the throne of Holland, the leadership themselves. They're going to lose all their empire shit. That's a no-brainer. That's gone. but that the private equity that came in to fund the war is going to be enough to keep the throne and the ruling elites back in power long enough to get their countries back up and running. And in the case of France, it was the same way. They had an economic crisis, but it was a very different situation in France because of the fact that the French Revolution happened in 1787 when Louis XVI was crowned king, and from Louis the 14th, 15th, and now the 16th, that was the end. They were always Louis. The Fleur family has controlled the throne of France, since the very, very beginning. The same family, always. Never, ever has it changed. Even to this day, there is a king of France.